Hello and welcome to part 2 of my video series on how to use Blender 2.7. In this video, we'll be talking all about Blender's user interface. We'll learn how to understand it all, we'll learn how to customize it, and in the last part of this video, we'll set up Blender so it works for the rest of this whole video series, and it'll work easier for you from now on. If you're using a newer version of Blender, that's totally okay. I'm using Blender 2.70a, which is available to me right now. If you're using a newer version, pretty much nothing will be different. If there is any large differences in the future, I'll make a new video in this video series to update those changes. Let's go ahead and click on the splash screen to get rid of it. Now, Blender is very, very user customizable, and it's built on these things called windows. The screen right now is made up of a bunch of windows, and we'll talk about them right now. The most obvious one is your 3D viewport window, and it's the largest part of your screen. And at the left side of that window is what's called your tool shelf. And this tool shelf, if you don't want it, it can be hidden with the T key, which is the keyboard shortcut to show it and hide it. And on this tool shelf is a lot of common tasks that you'll need to perform while working in the 3D viewport. One of the most recent changes to Blender are the addition of these new tabs, which divide up this tool shelf into different sections based on what kind of task you're currently performing. If you're currently working with an object and you want to move it or rotate it or scale it, there are buttons for that, which are basically just buttons in place of keyboard shortcuts like G and R and S. But here you can also do things like mirror objects and delete objects and join objects together, and there are lots of other tasks like that. If you have different types of objects selected, like a camera or a lamp, there'll be different options for you depending on if you have a mesh selected or something else. There are other tabs in here for creating objects. This is just like your add menu with the Shift A key, but you have a place for it always in your screen if you so desire. We have a tab for relations, so setting up relationships between different objects in your scene, for animation, for physics, and for using what's called a grease pencil, which we might talk about in a future video. Generally, I don't use this tool shelf too often, but sometimes at the bottom of this window, especially when you add new objects, there will be very important options down here. We'll talk about that in the next video. Whenever you hide something in Blender, you'll see one of these little pluses, and you'll see it when you hide the tool shelf. And so if there's ever a little plus and you want to see what that plus does, well, you'll know something is kind of hidden, so you can click on it if you forget a keyboard shortcut, and that thing will pop up. If you drag this panel away, you'll notice that as soon as it's all the way gone, it sort of snaps away and that plus comes back. So that tool shelf is the T key. On the right side of that 3D viewport though is what's called your properties panel, and of course you can click the plus to make it show up. But the keyboard shortcut for that properties panel is the N key. I'm not sure why they picked N. T is obvious for tool shelf, but N is not so obvious for properties. In this properties panel are properties for your whole window and for the object that you have selected. So right now I have this cube selected, and in the transform section of this properties panel, which I can collapse obviously, it shows me the location coordinates, the rotation degrees, and the scale and the dimensions of this cube in case I want to know those things, and that can be very important. I can have options that I can collapse if I don't need them, but again, this shows options for your whole 3D viewport as well as the object that you have selected, but generally I only bring that up if I need it. The next window in this Blender interface is this top bar, and this is called the information panel or the information window, and this has pretty much all of the basic things you need to operate Blender. A file menu to open and save things, to get to your user preferences, we'll talk about those in a few minutes, and you can switch in this bar between different renderers. Now, by default, Blender comes with its default Blender render engine, its old render engine for drawing out every frame in a movie. But in this video series, we're going to be using the Cycles render engine, which is a new way of using or working with lights and materials, and basically it is the way that Blender calculates how light bounces, how shadows look, and how to work with things like materials and cameras within Blender as far as it drawing out movies is concerned. So that's the information window. On the right side of the screen we have two windows, one up here and one down below. This top window, and as you can see I can drag the windows to make them taller or shorter or wider or narrower. This is called the outliner window. And this outliner window shows me everything that's in my scene in a convenient list. So right now my scene has 3 objects. It has a cube, it has a lamp, and you can see that the objects become highlighted in that list, and we have a camera. There's 3 icons next to every object. There is an eye icon, which hides that object from your viewport. There is a little cursor icon, which means that if you make it unhighlighted, that object can no longer be selected, which can be handy. And the camera icon stops that object from being rendered when you make a movie. So if I uncheck the camera icon right there, if I press the render button, and we'll talk about this window in a sec, that cube will not show up. I'll press escape to go back, and I'll click on that camera button again and click render again. You'll see now that cube shows up when I render out my scene. And again, escape lets you go back. So that's the outliner window. It'll show you a nice list of everything in your scene. The window below that is called the properties window, and this has most of the tools that you'll be needing to use and most of the settings for your entire scene. Now, at the top of this window, we've talked about this, at the top of every window is what's called a header bar. You'll see that the 3D viewport has a header bar, the outliner window has a header bar, and every header bar has a common button, and this is called the current editor type for this area button. I basically call it the window type button. But this properties window has a bunch of other buttons or tabs for switching between different options for different things that you're working with in your scene. The first tab is the camera tab or the render tab, which has all the options for rendering out a movie, like the dimensions of the movie that you're rendering out. In this case, by default, it's 1920 by 1080, which is the normal size for a 1080p TV. And any of the sections in any of these tabs can be collapsed, and they can even be reordered. So let's say I want the dimension section to be above the render section. I can drag this little cross-hatched area up and reorganize them and collapse anything that I want, but I'll leave it at its default. These tabs are case sensitive, which means that if I have different objects selected, these tabs will change because different objects have different sorts of options available to them. You'll notice that when I have a cube, in other words a mesh selected, I have options or tabs for materials and textures. Whereas if I have a camera selected, some of those tabs disappear, and I have a new tab for just the camera settings, like what sort of lens I have on the camera, how many blades that lens has, what my field of view is, and things like that. If I have a lamp selected, you'll see there's a new light or lamp tab, and in that lamp tab I can change things like the color temperature of my light, or the brightness or intensity of the light, and things like that. Alright, so that's the properties window. The window at the bottom of the screen is called the timeline, and if you've ever done any animation on a computer, you'll know what a timeline is. A timeline is basically a representation of time in frames over your whole animation. At the bottom of this timeline, of course, is a header which displays the start and end frames, which is the length of how many frames you have to work with. Of course, you can change any of these values, so if you need a longer timeline, longer than 250 frames, which is a little over 10 seconds at 24 frames per second. We also have, of course, like VCR or DVD buttons with play and play reverse and go back to the beginning and go to the end. And there's a record button. If you're doing animation, you can click on this record button and it'll start recording keyframes if you start moving or rotating or scaling things in your scene. Alright, so how is Blender User's Interface customizable? Well, any of these windows are of course scalable, but you can reorganize them and change their type and divide your whole screen up exactly the way that you want it. Blender by default comes with a bunch of different layouts depending on what task that you're performing at any time. This is Blender's default layout, but if I go up to the top in the information panel, I can just click on this little button here, and I can change to a different window layout. If I'm working on a video game, and yes, Blender has a game engine built in, I might want to work in something like the Game Logic layout, which changes the entire layout and has new window types in it that you can get to at any time. But this is a good layout maybe if you're working on a game. If I'm doing, let's say, UV editing, which means texturing objects, I might want to have different windows on my screen again. And you can always go back to your default just by clicking on default. Now, those are different window layouts, and you saw that those windows were different sizes, but you can customize even your default layout or any layout you want to exactly the way you want it, and you can even create new layouts. If you customize, the layout of the windows exactly the way you want it, you can click on plus and you can create a new window layout for any time you come back to Blender later on. But let's talk about changing window types. If I want to make, this, let's say I don't want this outliner window in my interface anymore, but I could really use another 3D viewport which always displays from my camera. What I could do is I could click on the button on its header, which changes the window type, and I can change this window to another 3D viewport, and I can have a whole another 3D viewport here. And if I want this window to always look through the camera, I can click on 0 or go to View and select Camera, and that'll let me see what my scene looks like through my camera at all times. If I want, this window down here to be another 3D viewport, or maybe I want, this bottom window to be something entirely different, I can change it to any other type of window that I want. We'll talk about more window types in future videos. But the next thing to talk about is adding or removing windows. If I want to have more than one 3D viewport in this area, what I can do is I can grab this little triangular cross-hatched area at the top of my screen, and I can drag it either across left and right in the window, or I can drag it down in the window. And what that will do is divide my window up into more windows. So what I'll do is I'll click and drag to the left, and that made 2 independent 3D windows. And again, with any window, I can change the window type. If I really want, and I'll make this window narrower, if I want this window over here to be just like this window, a properties window, I can do that. I can change it to a properties window just like that. And then maybe I can get rid of this one, and I can make it into a 3D viewport window over here. So you can really go crazy with this, and maybe you should, just to get comfortable with it. And I'll show you later in this video how to just reset Blender to all the defaults, or you can just quit Blender and everything will come back the way it was. Let's go ahead and change this back to a properties window, and let's go ahead and change this window back to a 3D viewport. So as you can see, you can make as many 3D views as you want to, and if you want to, you can make a 4-way grid if you want. You can drag down on that, down into the window, and then you can have one, let's say, from your front view, and let's drag one down here, and I'll make this one, that's my front, this is going to be my side, this is going to be my top, and this is going to be just from some perspective view. There we go, and now it looks something like other 3D programs like Maya or 3ds Max. If you want to join windows together, what you can do is you can do the opposite. You can drag this little cross-hatched area into a neighboring window. Now the little proviso here, you can only merge 2 windows that share an exact rectangle or a square. As you can see, I've got a different size windows in this side of the screen than this side of the screen. So this window and this window don't form a rectangle. They're sort of a funny shape. So I cannot merge these 2 together. What I need to do if I want to make this into one big window again is merge these 2 together, and then these 2 together, and then I can merge the 2 halves together again. To merge 2 windows, you can just do the opposite. You can click on that little cross-hatched area and drag it into the window next door, and it'll merge those 2 windows together. Or if you click and drag and keep holding on, you'll see that there's an arrow that shows up, but if you keep holding your mouse down and you drag down, you can decide which way you want the window to be dragged. So if I really want to keep this right window here, and I don't care about this user persp window, I can just drag down and let go, and it'll keep the right ortho view. There are other ways to, or there is another way to divide or join windows up. If I right click on the border between 2 windows, it'll give me the option to either split area or join area. So instead of using this little cross-hatched area, you can right click and say split area, and you get a line, and you can go across. In fact, you can go across any window and divide your window up that way. Likewise, if you want to join these 2 areas together, you can right click on the edge between them and click join area and choose which direction that you want to go. I'm going to go ahead and drag that window over, and now we have kind of our basic layout again. I'll change this window back into a outliner window. But if I just want to do this very quickly, what I can do is I can go to File and New and reload Startup File, and it goes back to the way it was. So those are Windows and customizing Windows within Blender. The next thing we'll do is we're going to customize Blender so that it works better for you from now on. The first thing I'll do though is I'm going to make this window a little bit wider so that I can see all the tabs when I have a mesh selected. And I'm going to change my Blender render engine over to the new Cycles render engine so that now when we make a movie and we make textures and lights, everything will look a lot better when we make our final animation production or any rendering of any scene. Let's go ahead and, you know what, I don't want a timeline in my default layout, so I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to just click that little cross-hatched area up and then keep holding and drag down, and that'll get rid of it. And you know what, I don't want a tool shelf at all, because I can always just press T if I need it, but I don't use it that often. Let's go ahead and make this outliner a little bit taller, and I think that's all I'll do in the interface. Let's go up to our preferences. So under the File menu are preferences, and preferences are one of the few times where Blender will actually launch a new window like that you can drag around that has close icons. You'll notice I'm on a Mac, but all of this should be the same on a Windows PC. In fact, I know that it is. The Preferences window is broken up into tabs, and under the first tab we'll sort of go through each tab one by one and we'll set things up so that things work really great for you in the future. One thing that you should definitely check that's not checked by default is this Rotate Around Selection option. If you have this checked, what it will do is if you have an object selected and you orbit your scene, it'll orbit your scene around that object. So the object will always stay in the middle of your viewport, which is really ideal. If you're zoomed in and you don't have this option selected and you orbit, that object could go flying off of your scene because the scene will always orbit around the 0, 0, 0 coordinate right in the middle of the world and not the object that you have selected. So that's the one thing that I would change in here. Let's go over to the next tab. In the Editing tab, the first thing I'll do is I'm going to up the number of undos that I have possible. Just like in Photoshop or any other program, you have a limited number of Control-Z's that you can do to undo. By default, it's 32. I'm going to turn it up to 64, which I believe is the maximum. It might be different if you have a 64-bit version of Blender or a 32-bit version of Blender, depending on what your operating system is, but 64 is a better number. Anything else that I want to do in here? I don't think so. Let's go on over to the Input tab. And definitely one thing you want to do here is you want to check Emulate Numpad. I talked about this in the last video, but what Emulate Numpad does is lets you use those 1, 3, and 7 buttons, but on your number row to change your views. So in the last video I used 1, 3, and 7 to go to my front, side, and top views, but I had to use my number pad. But if you have a small keyboard, like the default Mac keyboard or a smaller laptop keyboard, the number pad or the number row didn't work before. Well, if you check this, it will. You'll be able to use your 1, 3, and 7 and your 5 key to switch between orthographic and perspective. The next option that you should definitely have turned on is Turntable. It is by default, but the old default and old versions of Blender was Trackball. The way you orbit, the way the orbiting behaves in this window is much better in Turntable. You can experiment between those and see what I mean, but definitely leave it on Turntable. If you're using a mouse that does not have a mouse wheel or a clickable mouse wheel, you'll definitely want to click on Emulate 3-button mouse. And if I put my mouse cursor over that, you'll see what it says is Emulate middle mouse with Alt left mouse. So what this means is if you don't have a mouse wheel or using a trackpad, you can hold down Alt and then just left click to orbit like you would with a mouse wheel button. So that'll be very handy for you. This is also under the Input tab where you can customize all of your keyboard shortcuts. And if you're a 3D Studio Max person or a Maya person, you're a little bit saved here. By default, all these keyboard shortcuts are set to the way they are in Blender, but you can change them using these 3ds Max and Maya presets in case you really just want to use all the presets that you already know. But I recommend just leaving them at the Blender settings by default so that you get used to the Blender settings on other computers if you use Blender on other computers. Is there anything else I want to have checked here? Now I'm on a Mac and I have my Mac set to have the scroll direction called natural, and that's the way that it is by default on Macs. In other words, scrolling up and down is the opposite on newer Macs. So what I did is I want to be able to zoom in using my mouse wheel by scrolling up to zoom in and scrolling down to zoom out. So I've checked this invert wheel mouse zoom direction, and that's fixed that. So if you have a, if you have a Mac, you can play with that. That is for. And I think that's everything that I want to talk about in this tab. Let's go ahead to the add-ons tab. We're not going to talk about anything here, but what I will say is that, in most videos what I'll be doing is I'll be displaying to you what keys I'm pressing on my keyboard and what mouse buttons I'm pressing down the bottom left of my 3D viewport, and that is done with this add-on, which is a third-party add-on. It's in the 3D view section of this window, or the 3D view option, and it's called Screencast Key. So I need to enable that, and then I'll enable that later on my properties panel in my 3D viewport, so it shows up in every video. In fact, I will check that, and we'll move on. Themes is where you can change the color of anything in your entire Blender interface. If you want the background color, instead of the dark gray in your 3D viewport, to be bright pink, you can do it. You'll see different options for every single window. You can literally change any single color in any part of the interface that you want. But I'm not going to. There are presets, but again, I'm not going to change that. Under the File tab, you can change the default paths. In other words, what folders you want to be default for things like where the fonts are on your computer. If you're adding text to a scene, you can change basically any of the paths. I'm not going to change anything in here, so we'll move on. Under the System tab is where you can change things like the text size on your screen. You'll notice that my text, in other words, all the text and all the icons, are bigger on my screen than they are on yours, because I've set my DPI, the dots per inch for icons and text, to 94. By default, it's 72, but I'm going to leave mine at 94. You can play with those as you desire, but let's move on. I don't think there's anything else in here that I'm going to want to change, so I'll leave it. To save these user settings in this window, what I can do is just click Save User Settings. And if I'm working with a scene, this button is actually kind of new and nice. If I'm working on something already and I want to change my preferences, if I click this, it's not going to set up, it's not going to force Blender to load with other things that I've done already in my scene. So you can just click on Save User Settings and then close the window. And the next time you launch Blender, those settings will be saved. To make sure Blender stays the way it is, though, in terms of what objects I have in my scene and exactly how zoomed in and out I am and exactly as you see it now, I'm going to go up to File and Save Startup File. And what that will do is it'll save all my preferences that I just set up and saved, and my entire window layout. And this you can also do this with Control U. And I'll click on OK, yes, I want to do that. And now the next time I launch Blender, you'll see File New, Reload Startup File, but I have no tool shelf, I have no timeline, and everything is exactly the way I left it. And if I look at my preferences, let's look at the Rotate Around selection. Yep, that's still checked because I checked that before we saved our settings. If you ever mess up Blender entirely, in other words, you do something and you don't know what you did and Blender doesn't behave the same as it did before, you can always go to File and Load Factory Settings. Oops, File, Load Factory Settings, and Blender will go back to the way it was, and then you'll need to go to File and Save Startup File or Control U to save those factory settings to your default settings again. So Blender is very easy to get back to the way it should be, but we'll leave it like this. But that's it for this video. Please click on the like button below, and if you want to see more videos from me, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.